Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have with us Mr. André Wang, who is the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show for today. You know, there's been some interesting talk about Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Recently, he delivered a commencement speech at a Catholic college in Ohio in which he returned to what some called a familiar theme, that conservative Christians are under attack from liberals in a culture war that grips the United States. He told the students that both religious liberty and freedom of speech are threatened and warned them that there are certain principles that we cannot compromise without paying a fearsome price. You know, Justice Alito is an individual who's clearly a Catholic. He's made a lot of statements over the years regarding what I would call conservative viewpoints. But we're starting to see now that there is this question that if you are on the Supreme Court, should you be in a position where now that you should be, quote unquote, more neutral in your views? He's been on the court back since 2005. He was put on by President Bush. And there seems like there's now this renewed scrutiny because of secret recordings. There are other issues regarding him at his home having a U.S. flag that is flying upside down. We have a lot of liberal activists who are now coming in and saying, wait a minute, something needs to change here. You know, as I look at this, Dr. Golden, and we're seeing more and more issues and comments regarding possibly justices that are taking trips, making these quote unquote, what I would call partisan viewpoints. Are we getting to the point where there needs to be maybe what I would call more of a code of conduct for individuals who are on the Supreme Court? Or is that just a bridge too far because your personal points of view are always going to come in play? You know, what are your thoughts on this and where do you think we're going?
Well, I think that justices are human beings. Supreme Court justices are human beings. And as human beings, they hold beliefs like we all do. And Justice Alito, like any other human being, is entitled to believe whatever he thinks is the case with respect to culture and certain cultural biases or a culture war. The problem is that what we expect justices to do is what we say to justices, rather, is you can hold whatever beliefs you want. Those beliefs should not affect the way that you are deciding cases. But if we're going to be even-handed about this, we have to admit that Justice Alito is entitled to hold whatever beliefs he does hold. Now, where that becomes a problem is when there's evidence that he is deciding cases in the Supreme Court, not based on the record before him from the lower court, but rather based on those beliefs that he holds. And I think when we start to see that, it becomes a problem. I don't know if recent proposals for a code of ethics or for term limits on the Supreme Court, and certainly more extreme proposals from the left to expand the number of justices on the court, I really don't think those are good ideas. The fact is that we live in a time right now where conservatives have a sort of ideological, at least, stronghold on the court, and three of them were appointed by a president in one term, and President Trump, and that has caused a lot of attention to be brought to a lot of issues. Justice Thomas's unreported trips aside with billionaires and all of that, I think the best way to sort of reshape the Supreme Court, if that's the way to talk about it, is for the Senate to grow up and reinstate a 2/3 majority vote for the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. You know, it's interesting. Justice Scalia a staunch conservative, was confirmed 98-0. Justice Ginsburg, considered to be a liberal, was confirmed 96-3. I think somehow we have to get back to the idea that just because we disagree with people ideologically doesn't mean that they're not qualified to be on the Supreme Court. So I'm not so much sold on codes of ethics and on other things like term limits or expansion. For me, the issue is we have to get back to bipartisan confirmation of presidential nominees for the court, and the way to do that is for the Senate to really reassert itself.
Tim Schultz, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you separate your personal beliefs? On one hand, we're saying, is there any evidence? Some would say this is evidence. I mean, what do you think about this?
I just think that this is a case where both Justice Alito and Justice Alito's defenders and his critics are both right. So I think we have a lot of evidence that Justice Alito is a very right-wing guy. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. I've never met him, but I think that's a pretty fair appraisal. On the other hand, I don't think his judicial philosophy and the way he decides cases has really changed. I don't think there's really been a difference from the person people thought they were getting when he was first appointed by President George W. Bush. On the other hand, I do think that some of the criticisms of Alito are coming from people who would not make those same criticisms of progressives, right? Progressives, Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave speeches all the time in which she showed what her personal political views were, and they were well known before she joined the court. She was a progressive icon, right? And nobody criticized her for that. It was seen as totally appropriate for a justice. Justice Sotomayor wrote books, got big book advances, has had a big outside income. That doesn't mean that the stuff that's happening on the right side of the court is okay. It just means that everybody's kind of right in the criticisms that they make of each other, in my opinion.
But Todd, isn't that why he's on this court? Because they wanted an individual who, quote unquote, had these type of views, lived this kind of lifestyle. But I guess, is it incumbent upon a justice to really, I would say, kind of make a statements to demonstrate, even though I've got my own personal beliefs, I do want the public to be believing that when I'm making judicial decisions, that maybe that may not be coming into play, or is that just, a dream or a fairy tale?
Well, it is both, right? So, justices and judges are actually, retained. We talk about judicial temperament. We examine people's beliefs and their prior rulings. All of these things go into the selection of a justice, from, the local judge at a district court level to a Supreme Court justice. So I don't think judges are required to sort of leave their beliefs at the courtroom door. People, and Supreme Court justices are in a different setting, right? They're not making factual determinations. They're the sort of normal biases that you would sort of have people set aside as a juror and so forth. They're just not getting into those particular issues. What they're doing is making interpretations of the law, and that is heavily influenced on all sides by your judicial philosophy, how you view the Constitution, how you view the division of government, and where you see these lines. And there's just no getting away from that. That is the system. And I think, Tim Schultz is right. The problem isn't what Alito has said. The problem is no one cares about that. What they care about is that it's not their views, right? That's right. The fundamental problem is the people making these criticisms just don't like this. If Alito was voting all the correct ways, then this would just be a non-issue. Same thing with Thomas and all of his, alleged financial improprieties, often are going back a decade or more. The problem isn't the financial. No one cares about that. What they do deeply care about is suddenly in the Supreme Court, Thomas has even more power than he did, so they're dredging up all this old stuff. This is what you get. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was the conservatives that were getting the Supreme Court ruling against them, and the liberals who were prevailing. But everyone loved the Warren Court if you were a liberal, and now things have turned around, and then suddenly the Supreme Court's an institution that needs to be, quote, fixed. What they really mean by that is it needs to be ruling their way.
Well, André, is this much to do about nothing? Because, one of the things I've noticed is that most of the appointees on the Supreme Court have probably come from Republican, what I would call presidents. And at the end of the day, no one has really complained about this quote unquote conservative or liberal, or am I missing something here? Or is it getting just so much more partisan because that's just who we are today?
Yeah, so elections have consequences, and judicial appointments is one of them. Look, when you hold a position as conspicuous as a federal judge, not to mention a Supreme Court justice, whether you're Clarence Thomas or Sonia Sotomayor, you've got to be judicious in expressing viewpoints. If you've ever watched the State of the Union address, the justices are there sitting on the front row, stone-faced, no applause, no reaction, because they understand the partisan optics if they were to react to something in the speech. It's like when you tune into a Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing for a nominee. Their lives and their statements, both public and private, are parsed down almost to the syllable to expose their biases that will influence their judgment on the bench. And of course, their only response is that they will not let their personal beliefs affect their judicial temperament, their judicial judgment. I'll go further and I'll say this: none of us really are objective, but what you can try to be is fair. We can't be objective. We're all sentient, thinking human beings.
Yep.
We're going to have views and reactions to things. But I believe fairness begins with an awareness that we are not objective. And for judges, lawyers, teachers, medical professionals, anyone that has a subjective part in their profession, it's our professional duty and responsibility to be aware that we carry these views and carry that duty into the work that we do, that we can be fair.
If I could just interject, I like what you said about partisan optics and the Supreme Court justices at the State of the Union, and I find it interesting that as much as they are supposed to be aware of what they're doing in terms of protocol and being nonpartisan, that somehow didn't stop Justice Alito from mouthing the word wrong several times when President Obama openly criticized the Citizens United decision at a State of the Union address some time ago. So it's a struggle. It's a real struggle because we're humans. And as you said, all of our objectivity in some sense is compromised. But that was a point I thought that was worth making.
Yeah, but Dr. Golden, at least he didn't yell out, "You lie," in the middle of the speech.
No, but he did. He did. That's true. That's true. But he did visibly resist. And coming from a Supreme Court justice who is supposed to be stone-faced and not swayed by partisanship, I think it was very telling that he did what he did.
Well, I got to tell you, I think we're going to be seeing this type of conversation for quite some time. And I don't know if we're ever going to get to a point where you're not going to see what a Supreme Court justice believes on display in public and hoping that they're being fair when it's all said and done. There's an interesting case out there that's called Mendham Methodist Church versus Morris County, in which the University of Notre Dame School of Law's Religious Liberty Initiative announced its support of a federal lawsuit that's challenging the exclusion of houses of worship from a state historic grant program. There was an amicus brief that was filed in the district court in New Jersey, and basically there's an argument that's being made that excluding religious organizations from generally available grant programs, it both violates the law and harms the congregation and their surrounding communities. This seems to be an issue that we've gone back and forth with, where it's government activities that are coming into place. Here we're looking at wanting to utilize some federal funds to deal with a historic preservation trust fund regarding certain assets that you would call to be historic local buildings and utilizing resources to keep them up. Todd, we've gone back and forth with this in numerous states. And there's some that will say, listen, if you want to be, quote unquote, a church, you should not be taking any federal funds just to, quote unquote, maintain the historic preservation. But then there's the flip side. Someone will say, but if it's going to be available for the public, why shouldn't it be available for us? Is this ever going to come to, a reasonable resolution, Todd? Or is this just going to be a regular fight we're just going to have on a regular basis?
Well, I don't see it getting resolved anytime in the near future. Given our separation, sort of on its face, the idea that the government, at least in the United States, is going to pay for upkeep of churches would seem counterintuitive. I think the challenge, though, and where the church has the strongest point is twofold. First of all, government agencies, especially in the New York area, have no problem putting historic restrictions on churches and what they can do. In fact, in just across the river there in New York, in the city of New York, that's been a real problem. A lot of these churches will have huge historic buildings that they want to repurpose so they can better do their mission. And the government has come in and said, oh, no, we think they look pretty, so therefore you can't touch it. So if the government's going to put these restrictions on, I do not think it's inappropriate for them to also put in, to give funds to support it. I think the other half of this is there is really a genuine secular interest in maintaining historic buildings, and you cannot ignore religious buildings and churches when you talk about historic buildings. I mean, I think we've all probably toured Europe at one point or another. Like, if you didn't visit cathedrals or religious entity, buildings, like what would a tour of Europe even consist of?
Yeah.
And so I do think that there is a line to be drawn here. But the idea of just excluding all houses of worship, are you going to exclude houses of worship from all your preservation laws, from all your other zoning requirements and everything? And the answer is no, they're not. So, yeah, I think the church here probably has a point, at least on the macro level. Whether in this specific situation there can be an exception, I don't know.
Yeah, this seems to be similar to a case in 2015, also relating to Morris County and its practice of issuing historic preservation grants to churches. And then eventually the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that it's the state's religious aid clause that barred the use of taxpayer funds to repair and restore churches. So I believe that's the same provision in play here. In that the statute draws a distinction between historic preservation and no funding the building of and maintenance of places of worship. So the argument here is that if these places of worship are given funding, it would result in an imbalance of financial support to religious groups and constitute an entanglement of religion.
Well, Tim Schultz, what about the argument that if you have these institutions that are not paying into, quote unquote, the public trough, to be able to take that funding and actually assist it, even from a historical standpoint? Matter of fact, some would say, well, just make it an unfunded mandate. You've got to keep it up, but you've got to also be responsible for paying for it yourself. I mean, is there something actually wrong with that?
I mean, I think Todd made a really great point. I mean, if the government's going to place burdens on you and say, they're gonna impose costs on you. And the other point he made about there being a strong secular purpose in the preservation of historic religious entities, structures, that having funding go to them for the upkeep of those structures once those costs have been, once and remember, members of those congregations pay taxes, right? The congregation itself as an entity may not pay taxes, but certainly the members of the congregation all pay taxes. So I think this is actually a fairly easy case. There are lots of other cases that are not easy. That's why church state law, we're gonna do episode 1000 on this show, and we're still gonna have stuff to talk about because there's church state law is tricky and it's very fact intensive. I just think this happens to be an easier case.
I think it's important to understand that these cases will always be around, and there will always be a tension between these competing interests. The day that there is no tension between these competing interests means I think we've gone too far in either direction. So I think it's healthy to see this sort of litigation. I've always seen these cases from sort of a different point of view. As lawyers, we are often concerned about the legalities of the situation, but as a church member myself, as someone who spent a lot of time in an urban church in Philadelphia, what I can say is I've always thought that as a church member, the church as an entity, yes, I do pay taxes, but the church as an entity does not. And the church has a set of beliefs that supposedly believe in a God who is self-sufficient and who is capable of doing great things for us. And somehow I think, call me crazy, but as a Christian, I happen to believe that part of my mission on this earth is to reflect the image of the God that I claim to serve. So I'm concerned about the moral damage that's done to churches who participate in these government programs that fund different parts of their missions. And I'm wondering where that leaves the church morally and spiritually. Because as I understand the prophetic tradition of Christianity, the church is supposed to stand over against the state and rebuke it when it does the wrong thing. And how much is that mission compromised when the church is actually receiving money from the state to help fulfill its mission? So I'm less concerned about the legal aspects of this than I am about the moral and spiritual dimensions of it. But once again, legally speaking, we're always going to have these disputes. They're not going to go away. And they're an indication, I think, of a healthy, robust democratic debate about the role of the church in the state and vice versa.
Well, André, even though we've kind of grown accustomed personally that we like the idea of looking at historic churches, and Todd mentioned who would take a tour of Europe without doing so, but I guess the question is, who should be paying for that? You know, if a church decides that it doesn't want to upkeep itself and it falls into disrepair like, you know, many other buildings, I guess the idea of why isn't that just your responsibility, especially if you're not being required to pay property taxes or other taxes? You could actually be doing what most buildings would do and set aside, I guess, what I would call a maintenance fund of some sort so you can keep your building looking a certain way. Is that unreasonable, or would your average individual who cares nothing about religion make that argument and we'd say, well, you've gone too far?
Yeah, well, let's be clear that this is not a capital improvement grant or a plant maintenance fund. This is a grant that is for historic preservation, and there has to be historical significance to the structure. I mean, if you as Todd said, you take a tour across Europe, or take a tour across the eastern seaboard and some of these churches of real historic significance in America's history, and yet they say, oh, and by the way, we have services on Sunday, and so really, you can make this distinction between the history of the structure and the sectarian activity that takes place in the building.
Yeah, take a look at Notre Dame, right? I mean, first of all, it's owned by the French government, thanks to the French Revolution. And, it had money invested in it significantly by the government to rehab it after it had fallen into disrepair. And of course, most recently after the fire. Now, the French model for the interaction between government and religion probably isn't the one we want to replicate everywhere. But there is significant secular interest. I mean, that building is considered a national icon by the French people and around the world. And so this idea of just saying, oh, you're a house of worship, so we're going to exclude you. Again, they don't do that when they come up with the preservation laws and historical laws, right? They recognize it there. So if they're recognizing the burden, it seems like they can recognize the benefits as well. And, you're saying, so why don't they just set aside the money for, a fund? Well, they can do that, but why don't you just require that of all the owners, right? I mean, for some reason, the state has felt that it's been necessary to come in and give some assistance here, and that's because oftentimes these buildings, absent their historic value, don't make any economic sense. You would tear it down and building something modern, but we tried that back in the 50s and 60s, decided it was horrible, and now we have all these preservation laws, and so the government is trying to ameliorate some of that. The public puts a burden on, the public gives a benefit. And the state of New Jersey here, I think, is being sort of one-handed or one-sided on this.
Well, you know what I find interesting, Tim Schultz, is the fact that almost everything you talk about, you're either on one side or the other. This looks like an issue where it looks like this isn't really conservative or liberal. The idea of preserving your history and really funding these type of institutions almost seems to be, dare I say, bipartisan, or did I use a bad word there?
That is it's a word you don't hear enough. I just think that outside of the kind of extreme secularists who think that under no circumstances ever should taxpayer money ever flow to a religious entity, and there are people who think that way, I think they have it wrong. They've gone too far in one direction, as Dr. Golden says, right? Too far in one direction. I think for everybody else who thinks that in some cases, at least, these things are okay, I think that this is just one of those cases.
Well, I think when you take a look at what's going on here, that sometimes we have to be reminded that the law as it relates to a separation of church and state, probably something that we all want to keep an eye on, but sometimes there is going to be a situation where there's not going to be a separation of kind of local government and local religion just because it's in the best interest of the community. André, tell me something I don't know.
Under his senior picture in the 1972 Princeton yearbook, a young Sam Alito stated that he hoped to, quote, warm a seat on the Supreme Court.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I'm sorry, Orland. I think you know this, and everyone else here knows this. But we're here today. Obviously, I and all of us, I think, are mourning the loss of Pastor Lawrence Brown, who often joined us on this panel. And I have to say that I had the blessing of meeting him 12 years ago at a very dark time in my life. And this is something that our listeners don't know and may not know, but his warmth, his care, and his presence, his positive presence really uplifted me at a time when I needed it most. And we have lost a giant as part of the faith and politics family, and I'm going to miss him a lot.
Appreciate it. We all will. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Well, C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, The Four Loves, that when one of his friends died, the group of friends that remained didn't have more of each other. They had less of each other because of something that only their lost friend could bring out. And I think that's what we're all feeling with the loss of Dr. Brown. We don't have more of each other. We have less of each other. And we just hope that in the kingdom that is to come, we can shoot the 1001 episode of this show in the world to come, Orland.
Looking forward to that, hopefully. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Of the many talents and abilities of Pastor Lawrence Brown, early on, he was known as Rapper L, something that was great fun to tease him about as a pastor. But pastor, rapper, religious liberty expert, man of many seasons, and will be deeply missed.
Gentlemen, it was great having you guys here on the show, and we truly are going to miss Dr. Brown. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.